About 6 years ago now, a grouse just suddenly appeared from out of our woods at our house, and while I was raking the leaves, and started circling me. I sat down on a rock, and the grouse then suddenly jumped up on my knee, and then jumped off, then jumped back up on my knee, and introduced himself, and I named him Randy. This isn't in the poem, but that was his name. And he lived with us for 5 years. I thought this was a remarkable phenomenon, but I found out later that this phenomenon of friendly grouse, it's called, is not so uncommon. But he was quite a character, would walk down to the garden with us, would appear on our porch, not to beg from us for food, but simply to peer in the window. He made friends with our dog, a blue heeler, and would love to simply follow us around our property for 4 or 5 years. And how he survived through the winters, I still can't imagine. He must have hibernated in some strange way. But occasionally he would peer in the winter too, and just walk up to the house on the snow and see if we were still there. So I wrote a dance poem for him called Grouse Call, like a square dance call. And the poem is titled Grouse Call. Do-si-do and sail low to drum and bird. Slow it down, then pick it up. Once and a half and let her go. It's right by wrong you go. Turn to your left and freeze the dough. Promenade to the field below. It may be the last time. I don't know. Alamonde right with Mr. Crow. You can't go to heaven when you carry on so. Yellow rock, red rock, oh by Joe. Dangle now outside the no. Timorous, beastie, oh.
Danny Frank for GNAT TV. My theme on this show has always been that little Vermont as a state is populated with so many interesting, exciting, and unique type of people. And I'm very privileged to have with us today Chard deNiord, who is Vermont's Poet Laureate. Chard deNiord has been or is a professor at Providence College in Rhode Island. And Chard, you started your academic career at Putney School, right, in Vermont?
Well, actually, I worked at another prep school for about 4 years in Connecticut, the Gunnery School, and then moved to Putney School in about 1989.
And through your academic career as a professor at Providence, you're the author, published author of a number of books of poetry.
That's correct. Six books of poetry.
So, as Vermont's Poet Laureate, which you were appointed to, I believe, this past year.
That's correct.
What is your role, your mission, your mantra?
Well, fortunately, I have no actual contract as far as my duties. The governor has leaves that up to me, what I would like to do with this position. And every poet laureate has his or her own ideas about this position. But a lot of the same ideas crop up among all the poet laureates, and some of them are, of course, giving readings in schools, appearing on shows like this. Sid Lee, who was the previous poet laureate, was particularly ambitious, read at about 114 libraries throughout the state, wrote a column every couple of weeks for the local Vermont newspapers, invited readers in to read in Vermont at various venues. But my ideas are similar. I plan to act as an ambassador for poetry as much as I can. I'm one voice in Vermont. There's actually several very strong poets in Vermont, so I'm enormously humbled and honored by this appointment. But I really want to create a job for myself here that is the Poet Laureate that celebrates all of the poetic voices in Vermont and to enhance appreciation for poetry in Vermont. I'll be editing an anthology of Vermont poets with Dee Dee Cummings at Green Writers Press. I'm also going to be writing a newspaper column as well, as Sid Lee did. And I would like to also create a blog spot that's open to all the folks in Vermont to respond to my ideas. I was fortunate enough to get to know Ruth Stone, Poet Laureate of Vermont, the poet before Sid Lee, who I have succeeded. So from about 2008 or so until 2012, when she was the Poet Laureate. I may have those dates a little off, but she was mostly bedridden when she was Poet Laureate, so couldn't travel around. I hope that folks read her poetry. She was a national treasure as well as a state treasure. I visited her once every couple of weeks or so just to talk to her and get to know her and to interview her, and but also to try and get her up from bed. I felt that if she lay in bed too long, her muscles would atrophy and she would finally not even be able to get out of bed. So this poem is about that effort that I made over the course of about 3 years to try and get her out of bed. Getting Ruth up, for Ruth Stone. For 5 months, I tried to get Ruth out of bed to sit in her chair, then maybe stand for a while. No, she said, I don't have the strength anymore in my legs, and besides, I'm blind. But I had read her poems and knew how truthful she was as a liar, and so I continued to urge her to rise like the paralytic from his pallet and walk, at least sit up and move around before her muscles quit. And then one day her granddaughter, Nora, the milliner, came in and asked her to try on one of her hats, a 1940s felt classic with a feather, and wear it as she once did a similar hat 60 years ago when Walter was still alive. And she did, taking her time to swing her legs like arms onto the floor and stand, then walk again as if she could see just where to pose in the parlor and smile for the camera until she could smile no longer and walk back into her bright dark room and slept.
Chard deNiord, as Poet Laureate for Vermont, of course, you have tall shoes to fill. The first
Yes.
Poet Laureate was a world-famous poet.
That's right.
Was Robert Frost, right?
That's correct.
But Robert Frost, as we read about him, as much as Vermont likes to boast about the connection, he really spent relatively little time of his life in North Bennington, Vermont, right, where he has a home.
Yeah, no, he spent a fairly significant amount of time in Vermont. Was a kind of peripatetic poet though his whole life. He lived, of course, in New Hampshire.
He was in Massachusetts.
He was actually born in San Francisco, California. His father was a journalist there and died a relatively young man, and then he and his mother moved back to New Hampshire, was a chicken farmer for a period of time, taught prep school, for high school I should say, for a while, and then went to England, met up with Ezra Pound when he was about 40 years old. So his career started pretty late. Ezra Pound wrote Harriet Monroe, who was the founder and publisher of Poetry magazine, encouraging her to publish some of his poems. And then his first book, A Boy's Will, was published around 1910 when he was 40 or so. So, he had a long period there before he, was published and well known as a poet.
And I think there's an interesting paradox that a man of such prominence and accomplishment for his poetry, and yet he led a very sad and tragic life, born in poverty and didn't make, as I understand it, much of a living early on, and his family, his children, most of them died, early on in life. His wife was not well.
Right. No, that's true. He did live a very hard life. Of course, the epitaph on his gravestone in North Bennington is he had a lover's quarrel with the world. He was a very ambitious poet and strove to maintain his fame from early on until the end of his life, and was able to write extraordinary poems throughout his career. That's not true of a lot of poets, but he, in one book after another, won a couple of Pulitzer Prizes, was able to maintain just an incredible quality in his work. But yes, he did suffer terribly throughout his life with the suicide of his son, the death of a baby. He wrote perhaps his best poem, titled "Home Burial," about that poem, and died, a pretty old man at the age of 87 or 88 in Boston. Memory is a kind of accomplishment, William Carlos Williams wrote. That's the epigraph to this poem. I remember the drone of Francis Temple's farmall mowing in the dark of a mid-September night. Its deep, desultory blasts were also guttural, half motor, half cat, as it labored in the meadow back and forth, felling hay in 6-foot rows with a sickle bar that rattled like a snake. The memory of that mowing grows in my mind, which is also a field that's overgrown with every weed and type of grass, no less real than the tractor itself, mowing in the dark. I wake with a start to the sound of that engine, the same old farmall I heard as a boy, so that I'm forever waking and remembering at the same time to the accompaniment of a tractor I cannot see in the meadow, but know is there, as it is tonight, 30 years later, growing newer instead of older, as it takes me back in its moving forward down the rows of waist-high hay that fall like hair against the earth.
Vermont has a number of distinguished poets like Francis Fisher Brown and Louise Gluck, Grace Paley,
Yes.
Timothy Steele, Jay Wright.
That's right.
And the other poet laureates.
The other poet laureates, Grace Paley, Ellen Bryant Voigt, Sid Lee, whom I've already mentioned, Ruth Stone.
Julia Dorr, I believe.
Right. And there are many others. I'll just mention a few. There's Major Jackson at the University of Vermont. There's Mary Ruefle, who lives over in Bennington. There's Martha Zweig. As you mentioned, there's Jay Wright. Vermont is just fortunate in having just several extraordinarily strong poets.
Chard deNiord, can people today earn a living as a poet?
Just a few, just a handful. Poetry, is not a money-making enterprise. Such poets as Billy Collins and Mary Oliver can make a living. They sell enough and make enough on their readings. But no, poets usually have to complement their avocation, or which is really their vocation as a poet with some other career.
A poem of, let's say, 20 or 30 lines. Mm-hmm. What's the time requirement to prepare that? Of course,
that's a great question. Of course, it depends on the poet's his own or her own working methods and style, inspiration. Some poems just appear, are there, been gestating for years. Others take weeks, months, years sometimes. I'm working on a poem. I've been working on one poem that really isn't very good, but it won't leave me alone for about 20 years.
So is reading and writing poetry a good respite a form of recreation?
Yeah.
Should more people consider doing it? And how do they get started? How do they get into it?
Well, you know, that's interesting. Poetry is marginalized in this country. People don't recite or memorize poetry the way they used to maybe 170 years ago. And you know, it's language that stays with you and is important, and it's often in places we don't even expect it. It's in the Declaration of Independence, for instance. It's in Scripture, of course. We have to keep an ear and eye out for it. But I believe there are actually more readers and writers of poetry in the country than data shows, that official data shows. Government research I think came out a couple years ago showing that only 6% or less of the American public reads or enjoys poetry. Therefore, poetry must be dying. This is the kind of mantra that's been going on for a couple of decades now. But poetry isn't dying. It's maybe the readership isn't what it should be. But I love what Walt Whitman said about poetry, that the country absorbs poetry as much as the poet absorbs the country himself or herself. And I think that there are just hidden readers and hidden writers of poetry all over the place. It doesn't get covered, though. It's not celebrated in a way that sports is, for instance, or.
So you would agree that, say, the internet and the web has perhaps eclipsed poetry as a medium, as a literary medium?
I think rather than eclipsed, I would say has added to it. I mean,
added, okay.
Yeah, there's so much poetry on the web that's really it's quite astounding.
Facilitated.
Yeah. And the only problem with poetry on the internet is that it often isn't edited very well. I mean, you can find it everywhere. So someone coming to poetry for the first time might feel lost on the web.
So it allows for opportunity, right?
It does.
More poets,
it does
right?
allow for opportunity. Yeah. There's so much of it that I worry about some of the better poetry getting lost now, simply because there's always the next poem or the next poet who's being celebrated, and then is forgotten.
Chard deNiord, are our schools adequately addressing poetry as a subject or field of study, and how can that be enhanced or improved?
Well, that's a very important question. I think, like maybe perhaps any subject, whether it's math or history or English, a good it's really how it's taught, and good teachers are pretty rare in all subjects. So you'll hear from a lot of successful poets that they didn't understand or appreciate poetry until they came across a good teacher, somebody who could really communicate and teach poetry to them successfully. And so, unfortunately, there are a lot of schools where there aren't teachers who really get poetry or read poetry closely enough to be able to inspire students. And then there are those schools where they have. So it's a little bit of hit and miss. The internet is a kind of teacher for those students who love to read and appreciate poetry. But often poetry is viewed as just terrifying, difficult language for students. It's in lines, they're weird spaces. It's in a form they don't recognize readily as anything that they can understand the way they can with prose. So it really takes a good teacher to help break down poetry and demystify it.
So should Vermont educators consider you a resource?
Yes, absolutely. I'm there, and I realize I have to be careful with my time and pacing as far as this job is concerned. But yes, I will do all I can to try and enhance poetry and students' appreciation.
How many states have poet laureates?
Most. it's some 47 or 48. I think there are 2 states now, maybe. Massachusetts is one of them. And maybe Michigan is another that don't have poet laureates.
And is there a United States of America poet
Juan
laureate?
Herrera is the poet laureate. Juan Herrera is the current poet laureate.
So we've had a most interesting show today with our Vermont poet laureate, Chard deNiord. And Chard, that first name, tell me about it.
It's short for Richard.
Okay.
So my mother decided rather than call me Ricky or Dick or Rich to call me Chard. My father's name was Richard, and my great-grandfather, my grandfather's name was Richard. So she decided to give me another name beside all of my, my grandfathers and father.
Look for Chard deNiord in the state of Vermont, and look for his books and his poetry. Thank you for being with us on our show today. This is Danny Frank for GNAT TV.
So I'm going to read a few poems now from past poet laureates from Vermont. The first poet laureate was Robert Frost in the early 60s. Even though he lived in New Hampshire a lot of the time, maybe more than even in Vermont, he was Vermont's first poet laureate. And one of his most famous poems is The Road Not Taken. It's a poem that's often confused a lot of folks. I'll read it first and then maybe talk a little bit about why people are confused by this poem. The Road Not Taken. 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day. Yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. And that has made all the difference. So a lot of folks think that this is just about a kind of rough American individualism, taking the road that's less traveled or not traveled at all, and then clearing that road, bushwhacking that road in the figurative sense, creating one's own career, and making it the hard way. But there's one line in the poem that people don't often read very carefully, and that line is, had warned them really about the same. So both roads that diverged in the yellow wood were warned about the same. So the poem really then is more about just about decision making. The road that the speaker in the poem takes, even though it's warned about the same, becomes the choice, or is the road that that person in the poem takes, and then travels down quite far to the point where he wonders if he could ever return and take the other road, become a kind of Renaissance person, as it were. But he doubts that he can do that. And that wonderful ambiguity at the end of the poem, the road not taken. Is he happy about the road that he's taken, or is he regretful about the road that he didn't take? Is the regret and the happiness, do the regret and the happiness weigh equally in this poem? That's the wonderful ambiguity at the end. I took the one less traveled by, the one that he hadn't yet gone down, the one that he chooses to go down. And that has made all the difference. And what is the nature of that difference is the big question in the poem, regret or happiness. So it's really not a poem, a literal poem about American individualism. It's more a poem about the regret we perhaps feel about maybe not doing something else in our life. So a wonderful poem by Frost, perhaps along with Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening, his two most famous poems. The next poet laureate of Vermont was Galway Kinnell in 1989. So there was about a 20-year period with no poet laureates in Vermont. And so Galway became the next poet laureate, along with another poet named William Mundell. There was a debate about who should be the next poet laureate. And Galway Kinnell solved this problem by saying, we'll both do it, which was a wonderfully gracious decision that he made. And Galway and William Mundell used to travel around Vermont giving readings together. One was the choice of the governor, Madeline Kunin, and one Galway Kinnell, and the other was the choice of the Poetry Society of Vermont. So there was a wonderful resolution to a problem or a conundrum that could have been unfortunately bitter. But Galway, who was such a gracious and large-hearted man, solved this issue. I think I'll read a poem of his called St. Francis and the Sow. St. Francis and the Sow. The bud stands for all things, even for those things that don't flower. For everything flowers from within, of self-blessing, though sometimes it is necessary to reteach a thing its loveliness, to put a hand on its brow of the flower, and retell it in words and in touch, it is lovely, until it flowers again from within, of self-blessing, as St. Francis put his hand on the creased forehead of the sow, and told her in words and in touch blessings of earth on the sow, and the sow began remembering all down her thick length, from the earthen snout all the way through the fodder and slop to the spiritual curl of the tail, from the hard spininess spiked out from the spine, down through the great broken heart, to the sheer blue milken dreaminess spurting and shuddering from the 14 teats into the 14 mouths, sucking and blowing beneath them, the long, perfect loveliness of sow. I'll read one more poem from one of Vermont's poet laureates. This is a poem by Ruth Stone. Maybe I'll read two short poems of hers, some of her later poems. She lived to be 96, died in 2011. And one of her last poems was titled, What is a Poem? What is a poem? What is a poem? Such slight changes in air pressure, tongue and palate, and the differences in teeth, transparent words. Why do I want to say ochre? Or what is green yellow? The sisters of those leaves on the ground still lisp on the branches. Why do I want to imitate them? Having come this far with a handful of alphabet, I'm forced with these few blocks to invent the universe. She became such a fluid, wise writer in her old age. This poem, Tell Me, is just a wonderfully mystical poem. Tell me, Ruth, how's your vision? Lord, I say, know you not how it is with me? You who are blind to the sorrows of all things temporal, you who are not even the wind sliding under the door, how is it that I hear this echo, catching even in my blind eye the death throes of a distant star? And you say, voiceless as the forests on the mountains of the Sahara, of the Gobi, of the Kalahari, swept away.